What is up, guys? This is a video that I've actually been wanting to do for quite a while. I always thought it'd be a fun idea, and I actually got the itch this week to finally pull the trigger on it. And so what this is me giving kind of like an intro class, if you will, into becoming a horror fan, telling you a number of great gateway horror films, little onboarding horror films. Many of these are just movies that I've grown up loving or have been very important to me, or just classics of the genre. But I wanted to do it in a way where it's almost like an intro course. You know, if you're somebody that has never really gotten into horror, or if you're somebody that has wanted to get into horror but don't really know where to start, or if you have a family member or a teenager that you're trying to indoctrinate into the horror fandom, wanted to make some kind of a list of movies and steps to take to get them there. So the way I'm going to break this down is into 4 different stages. You got your intro stage, then your level 2, level 3, and then your final level. And slowly, as we move throughout these, we're going to intensify the collection of movies that I'm going to assign you to watch a little bit. Now, this is not like a definitive list of the best ever. This is no kind of a ranking whatsoever. There are multitudes of other films throughout horror history that would be just as worthy to be on this list. This is just the intro course from my own personal taste, where I would start and how I would progress through it. So let me know some of your guys' picks for great gateway horror films down in the comments section below, and let me know how it goes. If you put anybody through this little Cody Leach intro course to horror, let me know the progress. Did they pass, or did they run away screaming? And if they ran away screaming, did they fail the course, or did I succeed? So starting off with the intro course, I have 6 films here that I think are more on the fun side. And I think that's the best way to enter into horror, in my opinion. That's where I've had the best success with my own children, letting them watch some of the less intense horror films, the ones that we can laugh at, that are a little bit more tongue-in-cheek, a little more campy. And so for me, my own personal opinion, that's the best place to start, because if you can't take this intro level, then horror is probably not the place for you. Starting off with Poltergeist. Poltergeist is an absolute classic. This is one that's the classic haunted house film. You have a lot of elements of this story that are classic Amblin Entertainment themes in here, as well as a lot of really creepy special effects that are practical and do hold up quite a bit. And you do have a little bit of intensity in here that's going to test you a little bit, even in this intro stage. So you have like the face melting, and you got the bodies in the pool, but Poltergeist has always been one of those examples to me of an absolute classic that horror fans have always celebrated and always will celebrate, but is on that lower end of intensity that I think is a good starting point for even smaller kids. As long as they know that it's not like real ghosts and stuff, my kids enjoyed this one. Moving up from that, I had to get a vampire film on here, and I went with Fright Night, the original one. The remake is a lot of fun too, but it's a little bit more R-rated, a little bit more modern, even with some of the dialogue being a little more raunchy, so I would lean more towards the original. And this one, while having some intensity in here, is still a very fun and campy film. And this was actually the first film that I showed my son whenever I met my wife. I was told for months, he can't watch horror films. He can't watch them. He gets scared of them. He has nightmares. He can't do them. And I was like, okay, we'll test that. So the first time that we had a day where it was just me and him, I threw on Fright Night, and I was cracking some jokes here and there, and he had fun. He laughed. He enjoyed it. And he's liked the movie ever since. So this is one that I think is a really good one to check out, the vampire subgenre that's not going to be too intense for you. After that, you got one that maybe hasn't aged as well as anything else on this list, but you have The Gate, one that I always loved as a kid, and one that I think is a classic example of a good gateway horror film, because it's kind of so low budget that it's comical and very cheap. So you watch this, these kids, they dig this hole in the backyard that ends up being like a gate to hell, and these little claymation demons come after them at night. It's corny as all hell, and I think that you'll have a lot of fun with it just watching the old stop motion animation and claymation and things from low budget movies in the 80s. So another really good one to start with. Then you have Gremlins, and I think most people have seen Gremlins because someone's probably put it on in the holiday season, but nonetheless, if you haven't, it's a great horror film, and it's a great Christmas film. And what I like about this one is that I think Christmas in a lot of ways kind of softens the blow of horror. There's something like whimsical and fun about the holiday season that even in more horrific and intense situations, there's something fun you can never quite escape about the Christmas holiday. So you get great creature designs in here. It's definitely more on the horror comedy side of things, but it leans towards being R-rated without ever fully committing to it. You got a horrific story about the girl's father dying in the chimney and all kinds of stuff. So it's a dark movie. It's definitely horror for me, but a fun one, an easy one to get through. Then you have Army of Darkness. And as much as it might be controversial for some people that I say to start with the third film in the Evil Dead trilogy, the original ones, I think it's a good place to start because you don't really need to watch the first two films to understand this movie. It starts at a point where you can kind of get the gist of Ash and the Deadites and everything else. And Army of Darkness is the most zany, campy, and fun of any of the Evil Dead films. So there's still demons, there's still a lot of Deadites, and there's still skeleton monsters and things like that, but it's so much more of a fun movie. And Ash's performance is fun. It's not a movie that's going for the intensity and the sick visuals of the first two Evil Deads and certainly all the Evil Deads afterwards. So that's another really good one to start with. And finally on here, one that I added last minute because it's always been another one that I think of to recommend to people to start off with, and that's Arachnophobia. And I was just looking at the different subgenres that I was going through here, and I thought, just having something that's relatable as arachnophobia, a fear of spiders, is a good one in here because there's a lot of great horror films that play on our fear of spiders or sharks or snakes or anything like that. And another one that's very campy and fun and comedic, but is intense. Like if you hate spiders, this movie is still going to fuck you up pretty bad. So that is all of the movies that I would recommend to start you off with the horror genre. These are the ones that you should watch first. Really quick before we move on, if you plan on watching any of these movies in this course while you are out and about, then get yourself something reliable and quality to listen to these films with by checking out the sponsor of today's video, Rincon. It's the season of love, and it's time for us all to acknowledge our love languages. And I think there's one that we can all agree on. The love of sound. Ricon's everyday headphones are better than ever and are your perfect partner when you're on the go. Their latest model has a 40-hour battery life, a comfortable ergonomic design, and even active noise cancellation. And for me, the active noise cancellation is 100% a must because I cannot stand listening to the music that they play at my local gym. I will literally drop a barbell on my face if I have to listen to November Rain one more time. But just as important, they also have an awareness mode, which is important for if I'm doing editing work at home and I still need to be able to hear my kids in the house. Also, one of my favorite features is the new quick charge function because we have all been in a situation where we're getting ready to leave the house, but we forgot to charge our headphones and we desperately need them for where we're going. Well, with just a 15-minute charge, you can get 2 hours of battery life. And most of all, these have been an absolute lifesaver for me in the gym because of how comfortable they are, yet how secure they are on my head. Because when you're moving around doing exercises or you're going up and down on a bench, the last thing you want to worry about is an earbud falling out mid-set. And honestly, these are so comfortable that I genuinely forget I'm even wearing them. And even with all of that said, the best thing about Rincon is that you get all of those premium features for half of what the other guys charge. So if you're looking to add the everyday headphones to your everyday life, go to buyraycon.com/Cody Leach 20 where all headphones are 20% off. That's right, all headphones are 20% off on Ricon's website when you go to buyraycon.com/Cody Leach 20. And thank you so much to Rincon for sponsoring today's video. Now we move on to level 2, and this is where we're going to ramp up the intensity a little bit. These are films that have a little bit more blood. They got a little bit more of a mean streak to them. They're a little bit more dark in tone, while still very much holding on to a bit of the fun of a lot of the movies that I just gave you. And with that said, we are going to start off with the classic of John Carpenter's Halloween. This is a very tried and true, simple, old school slasher film. Most people out there seemingly kind of hold it true as the greatest slasher film of all time. I don't personally have it that high, but it is one that is a proven classic. But it's also one that, by modern standards, is not as intense as a lot of the slashers that came after it. It's relatively bloodless, aside from a couple of quick shots. It's not something that really dives into the kills themselves all that much. It's more so about mental tension and the suggestion of things and the supernatural nature of the character of Michael Myers. So I think that's a really great one to start off with, because you get everything that you're going to expect from the slasher genre moving forward, but it's a very classic version, a very simple, basic version of that is going to be easier to onboard you into the subgenre. After you move on from Michael Myers, we're going to go into one of my favorites of all time, and you have the original Child's Play. And Child's Play is much more on the fun side than something like Halloween that's going for much more the serious side. And as long as you're not petrified of killer dolls, this one's a lot of fun to go through, because you get the POV angles and things like Halloween, but also you have a much meaner, as far as the language and everything for certain, a much meaner killer in Chucky. And you have the danger of a young child in here, and there's a lot of fun to be had with this one. Tom Holland is a filmmaker who also did Fright Night, which was in the intro stage, is just a really good filmmaker to bring movies like this that I think have mass appeal to them. They're not something that's so niche or something that's like at an intensity level that only certain levels of horror fans can handle. So Child's Play is a good one to follow up Halloween with. And then we're going to move on to another classic franchise in the slasher subgenre, and we're going to go with Friday the 13th, the final chapter. And I can hear all the Friday fans now. How the hell are you going to start them at the fourth film? Easily. The continuity means dick in these movies, all right? Just like with Army of Darkness, I think you can watch Friday the 13th, the final chapter, and you're not going to have any trouble keeping up with what's going on. Jason's the killer. The teenagers are the victims. That's really all you have to understand. If you want to start at the other ones, that's fine, but I think it's best to start at this one, because to me, as far as the classic Friday the 13th films, the final chapter is easily the best one. So if you end up enjoying this, then you can dive into all the wild, weird, and convoluted lore of Friday the 13th, past and present. And this one is good because it ramps up the intensity a little bit from Halloween and Child's Play. The kills are much more intense. You get introduced to Tom Savini kills and special effects here. Jason is at his meanest in this film, maybe aside from the remake. And you get the best cast of characters that are a lot of fun to be around, in my opinion, with all the teenage victims. And then, of course, carrying on from Child's Play, you still have a child at the center of it with Tommy Jarvis. And so I just think this is a really good one to watch that to me is the best classic take on the Friday the 13th franchise. Moving on, we're back to the vampire subgenre, and we're going to do The Lost Boys. I think The Lost Boys is the best vampire film of all time. It's one of my favorite films, period, of all time. And I think it's a nice step up from Fright Night. I think it still has a lot of the fun. It has the campiness. It's got the wild 80s style and energy to it, but it's a little darker. It's a little meaner. There's a lot more blood. Whenever you get down to the third act and the craziness, there's like the siege movie and the action and a lot more gore going on in this one. So this is still holding on to that fun that's going to be easy to kind of digest if you're new to the genre, but pushing you just a little bit further into what to expect from the rest of vampire films. And it's the best one, so might as well get it on here somewhere. Then you have the It miniseries, and I had this placed in a couple different tiers because the It miniseries is a little complicated. It might be dated by today's standards, and people that watch the Andy Muschietti films first certainly don't understand the appeal or any of the intensity of the It miniseries because it's just very dated. But to me, this was one of the first things that truly scared me as a kid. Tim Curry's performance as Pennywise is something that literally haunted me in my dreams. And so I think that it's one that you can still have an easy enough experience watching it because of how dated it is production-wise. It has that TV movie quality to it. It's very 90s with its production design. But you have kid characters that are fun to follow for the first half, and then adult characters that aren't nearly as good, but still somehow you still warm yourself to them a little bit. It makes for a fun story. It makes for a good story, a good little mini series to dive into, while certainly being tested with how intense Tim Curry was as Pennywise, at least in my nostalgia goggles. Maybe you could be a brand new horror fan in 2025 and think that Pennywise is ridiculous, but we'll find out. But I wanted to stick that on here somewhere because that was a very important one for my childhood and my experience being a horror fan. The last one I wanted to throw on here, which is another last-minute addition just because I think it's important to watch at some point, and this is a good level for it, is the original The Omen, a movie that's dealing with religious themes. You start to get into that religious horror and a lot of that imagery and things. and a movie that has its kills, it has its intensity, it's got a lot of good tension in it, but is also more of an old school film. You know, this is from the 70s, and it's something that I think is just a well-rounded movie that is an experience that you have to have if you're trying to really be a well-rounded horror fan, if you're trying to get the full spectrum of how horror advanced from, you know, the 60s all the way to now. I think The Omen is an important piece of that journey. Moving on to level 3, and for me, this is where I wanted to go a little bit more psychological, get away from a lot of the fun, while you're still going to have some fun with these movies for sure, and get into films that get into your head a little bit more, as well as some that just push the gore effects. Kind of both of those at the same time in this tier here. And with that said, we're starting off with what I would say is one of the more psychological of the classic slasher franchises, and that's the original A Nightmare on Elm Street. You can't go wrong with this one or Dream Warriors, but you definitely want to watch the first one first. And this has everything that you got from the Friday the 13th and the Halloween and the Child's Play franchise, but so much more psychological. Freddy's a much different monster than any of the other killers, especially in this first film where it's very dark and serious what they're going for here. You get some great gore, you get some really good inventive kills. I think that a lot of the effects, despite being very low budget, even for the 80s, hold up very well for modern day standards. So A Nightmare on Elm Street, one of the greatest slasher films of all time, and I think it belongs in this level because it's a little bit more demanding in my mind than something like Halloween, Child's Play, or any of the Friday the 13th films. Follow this one up immediately with the original Scream. So we're doing a Wes Craven double feature here. I almost put Scream at level 2 because I think intensity-wise it kind of fits more into that level, but it would be a shame to watch Scream before you've experienced at least the first Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, and a couple Friday the 13th films, because you would miss a lot of the genius of what goes on in the writing of Scream. You would miss a lot of the tongue-in-cheek deconstruction of the subgenre. You would miss a lot of the references. You would miss a lot of the tongue-in-cheek nature of Ghostface's little games. And it is still an intense type of slasher, maybe not so much for modern standards, but it's definitely bloody. It's definitely mean, especially the opening. It's got a lot of tension to it, but it's still a lot of fun. So this is the one on this list that I think you could still have quite a bit of fun with, but it's a good place to watch it after you have kind of gotten through your bit of intro course into the slasher genre. Moving on from that, we have one of the most psychological movies, in my opinion, of all time, and that is Pet Sematary. The classic question that everybody likes to ask is, what is the scariest film of all time? And a number of the movies I have on this list is very common answers. My answer is always the original Pet Sematary. And some people laugh at that, but for me, despite it being a movie that has its elements that are dated for sure, the narrative of this film, the theme that they're going for, the subject of being a grieving parent that has their child ripped from them, and then toying with the nature of whether or not to play around, play God, and bring that child back and see what comes out the other end. Like, that to me is the most terrifying concept that I have ever seen in a horror film. As a father, it just hits deeper than anything else. So Pet Sematary, very, very dark, very creepy movie, very fucked up subject matter, but definitely a little bit dated that I think is going to shave off some of those more rough edges for modern viewers. So not quite final level for me, but Pet Sematary to me is a good one to push just a little bit further into that classic Stephen King psychological type of horror. Then we have the original The Evil Dead. So if you enjoyed Army of Darkness, you want something a lot darker, a little bit meaner, a lot more wild and crazy with the effects, despite being much lower budget effects, I think the original Evil Dead is a good one to go to. I think this one is, it definitely has some campy elements to it. It definitely has a little bit of that cheese that we have in the Sam Raimi trilogy, but for me, this one's toned down quite a bit more than Evil Dead 2 or especially Army of Darkness. This is still very much a straightforward, more of a horror film, where they're trying to horrify you with these effects. They're trying to horrify you with all of these crazy, wild, low-budget things that Sam Raimi is able to do. So very good one to move on to. And then the final one for level 3 for me that I thought would be a good one, I want to have a zombie film in here where you're starting to get a lot more into the gore, a lot more into the practical effects. and I'm going to recommend Dawn of the Dead. Now, you can do either the original one or the Zack Snyder one. I think they're both awesome for very different reasons. And honestly, whether you want to watch the original or you want to watch the Zack Snyder remake, I think the Zack Snyder one's a little bit more intense by modern standards, where the original is a little more slow burn, but has more realistic practical effects, that Tom Savini effect as well. So if you like what he did in Friday the 13th Final Chapter, check out what he does here. Either one of those will work here, but getting into the zombie subgenre, I think is very important. And moving on from the Evil Dead and that Deadite style into Dawn of the Dead, the more traditional, like hordes of zombies, and you get social commentary, you get a little bit more of what we know now as elevated horror elements in here. You had George Romero, that was famous for that, always tried to put capitalism or something as kind of the main point of his movies. So Dawn of the Dead, for me, I think is another really good one to attack at this level, to push yourself just a little bit further into the darkness. And finally, we have the final level here, which are 5 films that are almost always listed on lists of greatest horror films of all time. They are all proven classics in very different subgenres. And I think most of them here definitely ramp up the intensity even more from everything that we have seen, but also really just start to get you into that level where you're really seeing like these definitive movies that define horror all the way through to today. And some of these movies are 40, 50 years old. So you have The Thing. John Carpenter's The Thing, my personal favorite horror film of all time. It's sci-fi, it's body horror, it's paranoia, bottle horror. There's a lot of different things working here. But for me, this is one where you really start to explore paranoia, and you get, in my opinion, the best experience whatsoever that you're ever going to have with practical gore effects and practical creature effects. And even like just classic monster movies. If you want monster designs, creature designs, which we haven't had too many of those on this list, I think The Thing is also the cream of the crop with that. So if you like creature features, monster flicks, sci-fi, things like that, I don't think you get any better than this one. Absolutely had to throw that in here for your little graduation level. Now you have The Shining, the Stanley Kubrick film. And this is one that is all psychological horror. This is all horror that is a little bit abstract. Some of it's very nondescript. It's a movie that has a lot of ambiguity. I mean, there's elements of this film that people are still debating to this day and have arguments about what this means and how this ends and what this visual represents. And it's just a story about a man's descent into madness and isolation and being cabin fever, being stuck in an isolated location too long and you start to snap, and resentment between couples. Like, there's so many things that are explored here that are very real world, like grounded things that we all experience, like minute versions of, that are brought to this really horrific level in The Shining. Next, we have David Cronenberg's The Fly. And if you enjoyed The Thing, absolutely, you will move on to The Fly, and you might even like it even more than The Thing, because as far as body horror goes, just straight classic body horror. Not only has David Cronenberg kind of owned that subgenre for basically his entire career, but The Fly, in my opinion, is like his magnum opus. I think that you can have a very solid argument that The Fly is the greatest body horror film of all time. And you get a very tragic love story in here as well, which is something that we haven't really explored in this list yet either. So The Fly, really nasty stuff as far as degeneration of a human body and morphing into a monster. Another great creature design as well. So continuing on with the monster movies, the creature features. Then you have Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And again, like with Dawn of the Dead, depending on your taste, I think you could go with the original or the remake. They're both going to have a certain effect here. But I think for just the effect of having classic knowledge and starting to get into all of those real big cornerstone movies, I would recommend doing the original. Now, me personally, the original has always been a movie that I've respected more than I enjoyed. I've started to enjoy it more over time. I'm gaining more appreciation for it. But it is a very important horror film, a very iconic horror film that influenced a ton of movies on this list. So very grindhousey, very low budget, very raw and gritty, and it's more of an experience than a story. So it's, again, if I was to rank these based off of favorites, that would be lower on the list, but it's one that I think is important to watch, especially at this stage. And then finally, the one to cap it all off with is the original The Exorcist. That is the most popular answer that I have seen when people are asked the question, what is the scariest horror film of all time? The Exorcist is the classic answer to that question. It's not my answer, but it's the classic answer to that question. And despite being a movie that is decades old, it not only has inspired dozens of copycats, none of which come even close to what The Exorcist does, but it's something that was just so jaw-dropping and so boundary pushing for what they were doing at the time, what they were having this little girl say, what they were doing to her, at least trying to express what was happening to her. Obviously, there was a lot of effects at play. It's a movie that's pretty brutal. It's very gripping. Even by today's standards, The Exorcist still holds up as one of the more, a word I keep using, intense experiences that you're going to have in horror. And again, from The Omen a couple of stages ago, continuing to get into that religious horror side, which some of the best horror films of all time have a home in. So this whole final level to me is like that graduation level of, okay, I'm a horror fan, I'm into it. Now show me the classics, show me the cream of the crop, show me the tried and true cornerstone movies that have defined the genre for decades and decades. You watched a number of them in the first 3 levels, but this whole list here at the bottom is some of the best examples of that. Well, that's it. That is my gateway horror movie list, my little intro class for incoming horror fans. If you're somebody that actually is watching horror movies for the first time, if you're kind of a newer fan or trying to be a newer fan, kind of dipping your toes in the water, seeing if horror is for you, and you're going to watch these movies in the order that I've laid out, give me a bit of a play-by-play. Come back in and drop comments. Let me know how you're enjoying it, what's working for you, what's not working for you, which subgenres seem to be more your thing than others. We all have our favorites. We all have ones that don't work for us. Very curious if anybody's actually going to use this the way that it's intended. And for everybody that is a self-proclaimed horror master like myself, not really, let me know down below whether you think this is a good list or not, whether you think I missed the mark, what am I missing, or what have I put in here that is maybe in the wrong level. Give me some critiques. I just think this is a fun topic to talk about. So let me know all of your guys' thoughts in the comments section. Well, that's it for this one, guys. Be sure to check out Rincon down in the video description below. If you enjoyed this, click over here for all of my 2025 new release reviews. And I'm also going to put a tier list up here where I make predictions on all of 2025's new releases. Like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss everything in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.